All right, what's happening, everyone? Corey here with the Long Island Lacrosse Journal. We got a special guest in Coach Neil Hutchinson, offensive coordinator up at Harvard. Coach Hutch, how we doing over there?
I'm doing good. We got a beautiful day here in Cambridge. It's about 60 degrees, sunny outside, so can't really complain right now. It's been obviously, I'm sure everybody's in the same boat right now. We all wish we were playing and coaching and watching lacrosse right now, but understanding that there's a greater need for us right now to kind of stay home and stay safe, and just trying to do my part there. I will say that I'm sure, probably like you, Corey, that you probably found a little bit more time for some new activities and new hobbies. So running a little bit more and cooking a little bit more are some of the things that I've been able to kind of learn over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah,
So how are you doing?
those, yeah, man. Same thing. Trying to get my at-home workout in. Definitely cooking more. Good healthy habits. So trying to make the most of it, which is it is what it is, man. I'm also having conversations like this. It's like it's a treat for someone like myself because typically a college coach this time of the year, you're not spending as much time on Zoom. You're more focused on game plans and preparing for your opponent. So it's good to
Right.
have you on.
Scouting reports and film breakdown and all that stuff. So it definitely has led to more conversations like this. And unfortunately, I think one thing that a lot of people are missing right now is the kind of human interaction and the face-to-face. But, I'm sure you're finding, Zoom, FaceTime, all that stuff has really kind of helped fill the gap there. And I actually have gone back to just some regular phone calls, and that's kind of been pretty important to me. It just goes back to like the old school way. And I feel like that's how, like, our parents' generation that's them writing letters
Yeah.
at this point. So it's kind of cool how it's come full circle almost.
Absolutely, man. So let's speaking of going full circle, before we kind of get into Harvard lacrosse and your role within the program, can we go back a little bit and just kind of talk about yourself as a player and kind of what got you into college coaching in the first place?
Sure. I'll kind of go way back for you. So I think I got my first lacrosse stick when I was 5 years old, mainly because my older brother, Pat, actually played lacrosse as well. And I just wanted, like, I saw him having fun with it, so I wanted to do it too. So guys that were pretty prominent in the Baltimore area, the Radeball family, so Tucker and Dan, I think they both ended up playing at Maryland, were actually my next door neighbors. And so they had some lacrosse, genes that they were kind of comfortable with. And I saw my brother doing it, really enjoyed it. And actually my first ever lacrosse coach was a guy named Dan Llewellyn, who ended up playing. He played at Loyola. I think it was Loyola College at the time. And it's now transitioned to Loyola University. But I must have just thought he was really cool because he was my first coach. I always looked up to him, so I always knew exactly where he was. And I grew up playing for the Kelly Post Youth Lacrosse Association in Baltimore, which was one of the largest youth lacrosse associations around.
Hmm.
Really cool. Really enjoyed it, and kind of played ever since. I could never really leave the stick alone from that point. So my parents got us a goal for Christmas one year that they told us that we weren't allowed to hang on the top bar or anything like that. So unfortunately, my little brother actually had to get in goal at times because me and my older brother wanted to shoot on somebody. So my mom wasn't too happy with that one. And then I ended up playing lacrosse at Loyola Blakefield. So another guy that's kind of been pretty influential in my life is a guy named Jack Crawford. Played at Johns Hopkins University, coached at Landon, played at Landon for a little bit. I actually think he was out in California for a little bit before he took the Loyola job.
Hmm.
But he was a guy. And then Joe McFadden, who was a teacher at Loyola Blakefield, and then he was our offensive coordinator, were two guys that I really, really leaned on a lot kind of in high school, maybe as a wandering young soul, for lack of a better word there. But those two guys. And then I also, a guy that was my high school staff was actually pretty impressive. So those two guys, and then a guy, Tim Sullivan, who had a great athletic career at Princeton University as a defenseman, was our defensive coordinator there. So those three guys greatly impacted me during my time there. And then in college, a couple guys, Sean Nadalin and Anthony Gallardi and Dan Cacci, really kind of helped, I guess, kind of open the door for me to get into college coaching. And, as a player, I looked up to those guys. And, when you have Dan Cacci and Sean Nadalin suiting up in helmet, gloves, and short sticks, and they're going against you as a D-midi, you kind of know that you got to bring the competitive juices those days, or it's going to be a pretty tough rest of the day. You're going to be hurting a little bit. So it was cool to have that stuff happen as a player, and kind of forever grateful to that. And then they obviously allowed me to kind of get right in the door right off the bat and be a volunteer assistant coach when I graduated from Towson back in 2014.
That's great. And at what point did you kind of realize, like, hey, I want to become a college lacrosse coach?
I think in high school I knew, and part of that was my older brother actually was he had unfortunately had a couple injuries in college, and so he was an undergraduate assistant coach at the University of Maryland under Dave Cottle, and I kind of saw what he was doing and how much he enjoyed it, and would always go to Maryland lacrosse games to watch him, basically kind of warm up one of his best friends in Brian Phipps, and then, do some stuff on the sideline and stuff like that. So I was always intrigued by it kind of from that point. And then realizing that a lot of people that had impacted my life were my coaches.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, I know a lot of people talk about teachers being able to impact them, but, coaches kind of are teachers at the same time. And then, when I got to college, those three guys in Coach Nads and Coach Kachi and Gallardi were greatly influential to me. And I think they kind of really helped shape who I am today. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that, I'm kind of forever indebted to that.
Take us through your coaching journey after your time as a volunteer assistant at Towson.
Yeah, so was a volunteer at Towson for 2 years. We went to the NCAA tournament both years and kind of worked on the offense with Coach Gallardi there. I think we lost to Notre Dame in 2015, and then we beat Denver in 2016 in the first round, and then we lost to Loyola out at Ohio State. So it's funny how that one plays out because Ryan Moran was actually the offensive coordinator for Loyola that year.
Mm.
And it was weird because maybe about 2 months later, or maybe a month later, I might be getting my timeline a little confused. I actually got a call from Ryan Moran about potentially joining him on staff at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And, this will kind of go into a little bit greater detail later, but I really enjoyed living in Baltimore. And, it was a great opportunity for me to learn from a guy like Ryan Moran, who's one of the best offensive minds out there, in my opinion. So it was kind of a great step for me. It's another offensive person that I can learn from. And then from a defensive perspective, he hired Jamison Kester as well, who, a lot of people might know him as the Killer Bees on Twitter, but there's a person behind that. And Jamison is one of the best people I've met in coaching so far. And the one thing that I will say about him is that my work ethic probably comes from Jamison and seeing how hard he worked and how passionate he was every day. So after 2 years at Towson, I was at UMBC, and we came in there in 2016 as a brand new staff. We went to the America East tournament our first year, which was awesome. And, the guys there were extremely open and welcoming to us. So as a new staff, it was really cool to see that. And then after the 2018 season, I had gotten a call from Kevin Corrigan at the University of Notre Dame about coming out there and interviewing. And it was a little tough for me because I loved living in Baltimore and never wanted to leave. And I was actually living with my older brother in Annapolis at the time, and we had a great place that was overlooking the water. And, all my friends were there, and I was kind of really, I don't want to say content, but I really enjoyed what I was doing and where I was. And I think there's a lot of people in lacrosse kind of have that. And so I thought that I had kind of found what I was looking for. But when I went out to Notre Dame and met with Coach Corrigan and met with Coach Byrne, it was a really, really hard opportunity to pass up, and one that I couldn't pass up at that point. So went out to Notre Dame, was there for a year. We lost in the quarterfinals to Duke last year. And then about a month and a half later, Coach Byrne had taken the job here at Harvard University. And he had reached out to me to see if I wanted to be an assistant coach here. And, kind of after careful consideration of, do I want to be in the ACC or do I want to be in Ivy League, Indiana, Boston, where do I want to be? It was a really, really tough decision because Coach Corrigan had given me that opportunity to work at that level. And, it's kind of the same decision that I've had to mull for a couple of years now is, do I go with the guy that's given me the opportunity or do I go with, potentially a better opportunity? And, I've been happy with that. And, I've been here with Coach Byrne for 8 months now. And, learning from him, learning from guys like Will Corrigan and Ted Bergman and Lars Kyle on staff right now. And it's been an awesome journey, and one that I'm forever grateful for. And, I think in the 8 months that we've been here, the guys on the team have been awesome. The support system, from the administration has been awesome. Everybody from the equipment room to the compliance office to the athletic training, it's all been kind of a great fit for me personally. And, just seeing our guys kind of every day, and, looking forward to getting back to that when we can. But as you can see, it's a pretty cool place. We were able to practice every day in Harvard Stadium for the fall. And, it kind of makes you really appreciate everything that you got. So
yeah, it's
that's
pretty
kind
cool.
of my journey, and that's where I am right now. So.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And we can see the practice and game field right behind you, which is really neat. That's a really cool picture. You want to touch on that real quick? Just, you guys get an opportunity to basically practice here whenever. Do you play games here? Like, what do you kind of use the stadium for these days?
Yeah. So this is actually from our first day together as a full team, actually. Cool. I don't know. I was just kind of it was a wide open space and there was nobody really in there. There's a couple people running the stadium stairs right now, probably. But it's from our first workout, and it's kind of been just a memory that I've always had. Kind of, it's, on the background of my phone and stuff like that. So we were in there all fall, and then actually it's a pretty cool thing that Harvard does. They actually put a bubble inside the stadium in January, and it's kind of up, until the middle of March. And, we're able to kind of practice indoors at that point, which is cool. But if, we do have an unseasonably warm weather in Boston, we always have Jordan Field, which is where we play all of our home games. So our last game that we were able to have this year, we played Fairfield on, what was it, March 13th or something like that? March 7th, I think, was our last game. So we play most of our games on Jordan Field in early parts of February and March, and then transition into Harvard Stadium once the bubble comes down. So
yeah, it's great. It's a beautiful, setup, just the campus as a whole, not to mention the academics. So that's pretty wild, man, your journey. And, just being a Maryland boy from Annapolis, if someone were to ask you as like a young 20-year-old, like, hey, you're probably going to be be coaching at Harvard one day, would you say no way? Like, how would you react to someone like that asking you?
To be honest, if I was like 21, 22, 23, I probably would have said no way. Mainly, and it might be like maybe a self-confidence issue or something like that. But I always felt that Baltimore was kind of my home, and that's where I wanted to be. And I really enjoyed it. I love my family. I love my friends, and they're all in the Baltimore, Annapolis, DC area. And I don't know why, but I just felt the tie there. And, if it wasn't for the Notre Dame opportunity, I probably never would have left. Mm-hmm. And, I think if you were to ask me when I was at Notre Dame, would you ever end up being the assistant coach at Harvard? It probably would have been more reasonable for me to believe that. But, if you were to ask me my first year or two, I probably would have said probably not, and most likely no right off the bat, just because I kind of liked where I was, and I was happy, and really enjoyed what I was doing. Not to say that I'm not enjoying it now, because I absolutely am, and this has been a great opportunity. I'm really happy that I jumped at it, but I definitely probably would have said no if you were to ask me 6-7 years ago.
Yeah, what's also interesting about your coaching journey is just you've coached at a lot of different programs, different levels, different conferences. You obviously coached some incredibly elite players. We've also just kind of coached just different types of players. You just want to kind of maybe touch on how you approach and what your strategy is just to work with different types of student athletes at the college level.
Right. And I think, part of the best part of the day for any coach is going to practice. And I think that's the coolest part about it. And, there's so many different players, not only on your team, but on the teams that coach. So, whether you're at a university for 3, 4, 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, or even 2 years, you're going to have so many different personalities and so many different players on that team mm-hmm. that you got to figure out how to best connect with those players. And, sure. You can't just coach the top guy in every roster and not coach the bottom guy on the depth chart, because, everybody matters the same amount. And, you can't give preferential or special treatment to, a superstar or anything like that. You still got to hold guys to the standard of your program. And, I think that's part of my joy is just the different personalities that I've been able to kind of interact with and coach over the last 7 years has kind of made me who I am as a coach. And, I think you talk about it, at a talent level. I was pretty fortunate enough at Notre Dame last year to coach guys like Brian Costabile and Ryder Garnsey. Now, those are two of the most talented players. I think they were both first-team All-Americans at some point in their career.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of don't mess up what those guys are doing, and you don't want to interfere with anything. You obviously want to continue to refine fundamentals and, shooting motions and handwork and footwork. And then, there's obviously the player development perspective of this for a lot of people. And, even going back to Notre Dame last year, like a guy like Michael Drake, who was, on the scout team, and Davis Allen and Stephen Chase. So some guys that might not jump off the page at you, but some guys that they came every day to practice and they wanted to be there, and it was the best part of their day. And then, going on to some other coaching journeys. So, the differences of guys like, what we have here of like Isaiah Dawson and a guy like Nick Lauren, even though they're both, just finished up their sophomore year at midfield, they're two pretty different players. And I think that's a joy of it. And so you got to figure out a way to connect with one of those guys differently. And going back to, Towson, this might be one of my favorite guys that I've ever coached. His name's Mike Lynch, actually. And he had the nickname Radio. But he was a guy that he could run by anybody, and he just had straight up speed. But one of his issues was scoring and actually hitting the cage on some shots. And, that was his freshman year. And then he ended up being a guy that I'm pretty sure he started for over 3.5 years. And he kind of started on the scout offense at Towson my first year as a coach. So it was really cool to kind of see him, blossom and grow and really buy into what the coaches were talking about at that point. And then kind of going over to UMBC, guys like, it's really cool to see a guy like Ryan Frawley, who's from Mountain Lakes, New Jersey. I think, Coach Moran did a great job with him. He's, I think he put up, 45 some goals last year and was on track to do that again this year. And then a guy like Trevor Pachorky, who, unfortunately his freshman year, he actually tore his ACL and then played a couple games after that and I don't think he knew that he tore his ACL, but He was still producing at a high level. And so you got guys from, all different kind of geographies of the country, and, whether they're from California or New Jersey or Texas up to, Boston or, even Canada. I think that's been the cool part of my journey, is that you have so many different personalities, so many different people. So trying to find the best way to connect with those guys and trying to find the best way that they learn, I think is important. So whether it's, do they learn best by watching film of themselves? Do they learn best by actually repping the drills out? Do they learn best by a one-on-one setting or kind of a group setting? So I think, those struggles and those challenges have definitely forced me to become a better coach, but I think that's kind of part of the really cool aspect there. And, I think as a coach, you enjoy just being on the field with your guys and seeing the guys every day, whether they're in the locker room, getting ready for a lift or getting ready for practice. I think those are some of the hidden parts of the day that coaches really, really look forward to.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that approach is, I'm sure your kids really appreciate it, because regardless of where they are on the depth chart, they're getting coached and developed, and they feel as though they're just as much a part of the team, which I think is great. Not to mention, a kid on a scout team at Notre Dame is still tremendously talented, relative to the rest of the players around the country. So that's something that kind of goes under the radar.
I think, you got to embrace that role a little bit, because it's cool to see it. And two of those guys that I mentioned from Notre Dame, Mike Drake and Stephen Chase, I think they both scored against Maryland this year in a big game for them. So It was awesome to see that. And then, even, looking at some guys that we got here at Harvard, like a lot of guys bought into what we were preaching and teaching. And it was cool to see some guys have some success with some of the stuff that we were, really emphasizing in practice.
Sure. I mean, also just scout players in general. You made a great example of those guys that scored against Maryland, how they're, if they work hard enough, they can become contributors in years to come. But also as a scout team member, it's not an easy job. Like, you're sometimes assuming the role of like completely different players with different styles, and you have to really adapt and be kind of creative, and you need to have a skill set to do that. Did you notice that some guys like when they did embrace it, they really, actually helped their game in the long run, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's a guy like Mike Lynch that was perfect with it because, um, he was a speed dodger, and I think when he got really good at realizing that he could just run by a lot of guys and kind of create some offense, um, and he just kept to that and simplified his game. I think that's where he really saw his game take off, and he kind of developed a little bit of confidence with him. And I think, to your point about developing some new skills, it's, they might be one guy this week and then a completely different guy the next week.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think when you kind of break it down to them, it's like, hey, this is one little thing that guy does really well. If you can kind of simulate this, this is how it can translate to your game. I think that kind of becomes beneficial. And, now those guys see, all right, this is why, player A is so successful or player B is so successful, that it really kind of creates a little bit more of an ownership of, hey, if I do this to a really high standard, then I too could be that player. And, a guy like Mike Lynch was a great example of that. He worked his ass off every day, was a great player. And, some of those guys, him and that class of like Ryan Drenner and Joe Sider ended up taking Towson to a Final Four. So it was really cool to see those guys that kind of bought into all the hard work that the staff was preaching, see their work pay off for them.
That's great. And let's talk a little about your personal offensive just philosophy, how you approach things and how you develop it from an individual perspective to kind of like a team perspective.
Yeah, I think from an individual perspective, kind of starting there, it's refining fundamentals and kind of reinforcing that, because when in doubt, at the end of all this stuff, you're going to kind of fall back on your training when you might get cross-checked to the helmet and no referee is going to throw the flag in that situation, or something doesn't happen, but you kind of fall back on your training at that point. So, really kind of individual development is an important part of the fall and kind of even still in the spring, because you have to constantly get better. If you're just who you are and that's what you are in February, then you're not going to be able to kind of peak when you want to peak at the end of the season. So focusing on the individual development piece is huge. So with that being said, it kind of depends on what type of player that you are and how we can get the maximum out of that player and get them to play at the standard that we want them to play. So, asking a left-handed shooter to be a right-handed alley dodger, that's not what we're going to try and ask for, but how can we develop that left-handed shooter to be, how can we add an element to his game where maybe he's a feeder or maybe he's a 3 to 5 step dodger, or maybe he's a guy that dodges on the backside, or, how can we develop some of our alley dodgers to be a little bit more wing dodge, middies or whatever it might be. I think each team has to, think critically about who they are, where they are, and what they want to be. Mm-hmm. And then kind of from an overall offensive philosophy, it's, from my perspective, is trying to create opportunities for guys to be successful and put them in a position where they know what they're doing and they don't feel like they're out of place, and kind of reinforcing the confidence that we have in them as players. And I think, from an offensive standpoint, it can't just be black and white where it's you have to do this or you have to do that. You have to kind of be able to let them play. I think a lot of coaches are calling it the gray now. So you got to let them play in that gray area a little bit, where you got to let them be creative and you got to let people make decisions, and you got to kind of live with that. And, if you're an offensive player and you're thinking I have to do A or B, then you're going to kind of be paralyzed by making that one decision. So we kind of enforce with our guys of make your decision and go with it. And then you have to, everybody else has to kind of react to what that decision was, whether it was a dodge and clearing space, or somebody's, coming to set a pick for you, whatever it might be. So, I think a little bit more free flowing and allowing guys to make decisions, and, the reactions of those decisions are where we really kind of play our offense.
Yeah. And in terms of decision making, which I agree is such an important part of just offense, and especially being effective at like the highest level, is that something that you guys kind of practice, whether it be, in the fall in your training, or whether it be a practice or things you do to kind of help your kids kind of through that process?
Yeah. And we have a couple of drills that communication and decision-making are the two main emphasis of that drill. And we probably do those pretty regularly throughout the fall and early part of the spring. And it's just a great way to really get guys involved. You get guys communicating to each other, and you get guys kind of simulating in their own head of, hey, this is happening, so that when they do get to the game or the scrimmage or the 6v6 segment in practice, they're kind of prepared for those situations.
Mm-hmm.
And we will obviously do some, small parts offensive drills where we are focusing on, maybe it's a specific decision where we're like, hey, we want to see how guys react in this spot. And we're able to kind of film that, evaluate it, break it down, and show guys, hey, these are a couple of good examples, or hey, these are a couple of bad examples. At that point, we're kind of grateful to have the film service that we do have. And, I think there's some other drills that we're going to do moving forward this fall. And that's one thing that I've been able to kind of take away from the quarantine right now is a little bit of creativity with, how we can maximize our practice time and how we can maximize some of the stuff that we're trying to get better at as an offensive group. So the decision-making that you're talking about is definitely going to be kind of an important role there, because, decisions are everything that we do offensively.
Sure. And no, that's great, Coach. And one way we always like to leave kind of like the conversation here, after we've learned a little bit about you and the program and your approach, is just maybe just a word of advice, because a big audience of ours and people that follow the Long Island Lacrosse Journal are like kind of lacrosse recruits and families who have
Right.
kids that are kind of going through it, and it's kind of a weird time and definitely uncertain. But what's maybe one piece of advice you can offer up to a recruit that might kind of help them through it at this point?
Yeah, I think from a recruit standpoint and I feel like this phrase is getting used a lot right now, but being able to control what you can control. All right, so as a player, you can't control when we're going to be able to get back on the field. You can't control what team you make. You can't control, what event you're going to as a team. You can't control what coach is on the sideline watching you, and you can't control what coach is reaching out to you directly right off the bat. What you can control is yourself personally, and understanding that, hey, this is a great time for you to kind of commit to yourself and buy in and really focus on what you can be really good at. So, from an offensive player, it's a great time to, have the stick in your hand, or going out and shooting, or a defensive, personnel working on approaches and working on your footwork, face-off guys working on technique. There's so many little aspects of the game that you can be working on individually right now, but if you can focus and work on your craft and your game right now, then when we are out of this quarantine and we are in a position where we can, be back on the field, it's going to shine, and it's going to show that you were committed to yourself at that point, that, hey, that player A did what he needed to do during this time. And I think that's a big part of just kind of the evaluation itself moving forward.
Yeah, that's great advice. Well, Coach Hutchinson, we really appreciate your time, and we look forward to sharing your journey and all your great advice and experience to the Long Island lacrosse community.
You got it. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, Corey.